I'm going to let you in on an open secret. I have no talent in mixing music or t-shirt design. I cannot do an English accent, Irish accent, or Afrikaans accent to save my life. Nor do I have the vocal range to give you the deep-voiced opening you hear at the start of each episode. The good news for me is there is always Fiverr. Fiverr.com allows you to hire freelancers for sometimes as little as $5 to do tasks that you have to get done for your business. Or sing happy birthday to your spouse in ways that are impossible for you. Or, honestly, the list could go on. Help yourself and help the show by using the link I provide in the show notes to see if Fiverr's freelancers can help you. Or if you have anything to offer Fiverr. My show was not possible without Fiverr. Some meaningful work in your life may now become possible with Fiverr. Go ahead and open the link in our show notes right now. Now, on to our show.
This is Forgotten Wars.
Black Week closed with General Buller being humiliated, yet again. But Buller would not give up on relieving besieged British forces at Ladysmith. Forces facing a Boer siege surpassing 3 months. Those trapped inside of Ladysmith faced more hunger and dysentery as they waited more weeks for rescue. General White was wrangling with the War Office over the possibility of surrendering Ladysmith. The now former Commander-in-Chief of British operations in South Africa, General Buller, set his mind to another attack that amounted to charging secure Boer positions with hopes that these positions would finally break. Some of you right now are laughing at what sounds insane, perhaps grimacing of what sounds like another operation that will result in much loss of life. But before believing that Buller was about to embark on something as close to the textbook definition of insanity as possible, keep this in mind. Buller knew that many more Boers had headed home after Spioenkop. One of the Boers who had left for home was Louis Botha. So perhaps this time would be different.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire. But that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks, active part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
Louis Botha took advantage of another lull in fighting after Spioenkop to slip back home by train to Pretoria to visit his family. This left General Schalk Burger in charge in Natal. Botha gave his best effort to blend in on the train as just an ordinary Boer. Not a single person greeted Botha when he arrived in Pretoria. Mission accomplished. Botha reported to President Creer, then spent 2 much-needed days of rest with Annie and the kids. Earlier, Annie made him a simple coat with no indication of Louis's rank as general. Annie presented Louis with this coat when Louis came home. But Boer intelligence found out that General Buller would make a third attempt to break through the Boer ring around Ladysmith, this time around Vaalkrans. But Buller took his time again, preparing for this attack. Orange Free State President Martinus Steyn caused confusion among Boer ranks by appointing General Martinus Prinsloo as overall commander in Natal. Piet Joubert urgently called Louis Botha back. After Botha returned, he continued reporting to Joubert, not Prinsloo. However, Botha did not arrive until February 6th, until the Battle of Vaalkrans had already begun. Only 3,500 Boers, 8 artillery pieces, and 2 Maxim guns stood ready to defend a 20-mile front against Buller's nearly 25,000-man force, equipped with 72 guns. Pretorius reports, quote, "The only advantage the Boers had was that Buller was unsure of the Boer numbers and the exact location of their positions." End quote. The British launched some diversionary attacks on February 5th. Colonel A.S. Wynne launched one of those attacks at 6 a.m., northwest of Vaalkrans Hill. Then, around 2 p.m., withdrew his forces for the main attack. At the same time, the man who had led a whisper campaign against General Buller, one General Neville Littleton, led the 4th Light Brigade in an attack on Vaalkrans Hill, while British artillery shelled Commandant Ben Viljoen's forces that held the hill. Vaalkrans Hill would see the most intense artillery fire of the war up to that point. Commandant Viljoen successfully withdrew his men and their Maxim gun to Groenkoop, east of Vaalkrans. From Groenkoop, Viljoen's men and other Boers on Braakfontein Hills fired on General Littleton's men who had just taken Vaalkrans. Nasson writes this of the British plan, quote, "The entire advance was based on a staggered series of diversionary troop movements and feint attacks designed to bluff the defenders as to where the British really aimed to make their chief gains." End quote. But when the Boer bullets and shells rained on Littleton's men at unexpectedly high volumes, this really threw a wrench into plans to tightly coordinate infantry and cavalry attacks. Instead of using Littleton's position to help hone in on Doornkoop, Buller stopped and wheeled forces away from Doornkoop. This left Littleton in a terrible position. Littleton's men dug in on Vaalkrans that February 5th evening. On the morning of February 6th, the Boers received 2 important deliveries, Louis Botha and one of their famed Long Tom artillery pieces. Though only 4 of these Long Toms existed, and though their full potential was never realized, these Long Toms made major impacts on the battlefield. These Long Tom artillery pieces could fire 11,000 yards. Their range was so superior to British artillery pieces during the sieges of Mafeking and Ladysmith that the British had to adapt some of their naval guns for land use. When the Boers began shelling Littleton's men on Vaalkrans with the newly arrived Long Tom, General Buller swirled with second thoughts. So Buller ordered Littleton to withdraw from Vaalkrans to safer ground. Littleton, incredulous, ignored the order for all of February 6th. Buller telegraphed the new Commander-in-Chief Roberts, asking if they should stick to their attack around Vaalkrans if it cost 2,000 to 3,000 of Buller's men. Roberts insisted that Buller persevere, so Buller sent Major General Hilliard up with the brigade to replace Littleton's men. But Buller refused Littleton's pleas to strike Doornkoop as part of the original plan. Instead, Buller waffled for most of February 6th and into February 7th. Botha did not waffle. With the wind blowing towards the British positions, Boers set fire to the grass and scrub to set a screen, to cover a coordinated angling assault. Botha concentrated so much firepower on Vaalkrans that Buller believed his Brits were facing between 12,000 and 16,000 Boers, 4 to 5 times as many Boers as there actually were. Major General Hilliard's men were pinned down. By 4 p.m. on February 7th, Buller chose to withdraw. The Boers suffered less than 100 casualties, while the British suffered nearly 400. Buller spoke with satisfaction about how uncommonly well his troops had executed their withdrawal from Vaalkrans. His chief of staff, less impressed, said, quote, "Yes, sir, We've practiced it twice. But the Battle of Vaalkrans marked a significant turning point. This would be the last time the British chose to fight a set-piece battle, at least in the style of Black Week. Instead, Buller and company focused more on winning with, quote, logistics and improved mobility, adherence to more exacting techniques and tactics, and elaborately prepared movements of encirclement, end quote. Finally, the British would rely less on brute force and bravery. The South African War was about to take a turn for the worse for the Boers. Boers besieged Ladysmith with up to 9,900 men beginning on October 30th, 1899. As more Boers flowed home or to reinforce the Tugela line, those besieging Ladysmith slipped to 5,500. The Daily Mail correspondent George Stevens reported that the besieging Boers made war like gentlemen of leisure, with no bombardments on Sundays or rainy days, and with few evening bombardments. Stevens would suffer the same fate as some residents of Ladysmith when he died of typhoid fever in January of 1900. You can review what typhoid fever does to people by clicking on the link that I provide in the show notes. The Boers planned only a couple attacks on Ladysmith on November 9th and November 30th. Both failed miserably. The November 30th attack failed because 15 Boer junior officers bailed on the operation. The besiegers didn't even attempt to flood the town. They merely waited to starve out the besiegers. This waiting around for starvation and surrender had worked in the Mapoke War you learned about in episode 1.15, and the Boer-Bagananwa War you learned about in episode 1.17, but waiting for starvation and surrender against this British enemy proved to be a huge mistake. At first, the British calculated enough food rations to provide full rations to the soldiers and civilians of Ladysmith for 2.5 months. Soon, the army sold bread and meat at fair prices to civilians, but the poor could afford little. Even after Buller's shoot away ammo and consider surrender telegram, some British officers showed enough pluck to mount attacks on Boer guns at Gun Hill and Surprise Hill on successive days in early December. These successful attacks, paired with the monotony and perhaps hopelessness felt by Boer besiegers, helped thin their ring around Ladysmith even more, eventually to as few as 3,500 men. But those in Ladysmith grew more desperate after Buller failed again to break through at Vaalkrans. General White reduced rations even more to where one eyewitness reported that we began to grow stupid with starvation. Typhoid fever and dysentery cases spiked even more. Dysentery causes stomach cramps and diarrhea. Diarrhea in this food-starved place would prove deadly. By late January, General White finally did what many of his junior officers already knew was necessary. White gave up on keeping the horses for the cavalry fed. The horses and the mealies for the horses were converted to food. The alternative was running out of food in mid-February. Men of the cavalry brigade protested having to eat and watch others eat their horses, but the protests were in vain because the logic of dismembering the cavalry was sound. Converting the cavalry and reducing rations would buy Ladysmith's people an additional 2 months if necessary. A message from the new Commander-in-Chief, Lord Roberts, gave new hope to the Ladysmith garrison on February 16th. We will get to that momentous message later. Buller also provided some hope by transmitting yet another set of plans he had to relieve Ladysmith. The Ladysmith garrison wondered day after day if these hopes would ever be realized. The Ladysmith garrison had heard the sounds of false hope several times since General Buller's army arrived. The sounds of shelling and shooting between Boer and British forces. Sounds that ultimately signaled British defeat after British defeat after British defeat. A series of battles spanning parts of 2 weeks sending more sounds of hope to Ladysmith's ear, started in mid-February. General Buller decided to shift his attention from the upper Tugela to Hlongwane Hill, east of Colenso. About 5,500 Boers stretched over more than 6 miles, defending Hlongwane Hill, as well as Green Hill, and I won't get this one right because I can't do the click at the beginning, Klingolo Hill, Comba Sprite, and Monte Cristo Hill. General Neville Littleton kicked off clashes by attacking Boer positions east of the Tugela on February 17th, and managed to take Klingolo Hill. The next day, Major General Henry Hilliard captured Monte Cristo, while Colonel Norcott and Major General Geoffrey Barton captured Green Hill. General Littleton did something that will probably strike you as being common sense, but was definitely not practiced by General Warren or General Buller. General Littleton used his whole force in these early actions, rather than keeping a huge number in reserve. This marked a lesson learned. On February 19th, Boers crossed back over the Tugela to where they hoped was more safety. These tactical retreats by Boers boosted British morale. General Buller led another slow advance under cover of heavy artillery fire to the edge of the plateau overlooking the Tugela. General Louis Botha saw Boers so demoralized that he thought it was hopeless to continue laying Ladysmith to siege. Botha suggested the Boers withdraw to Bihartsberg, more than 40 miles away. Piet Joubert and President Paul Kruger refused this request and instead demanded the Boers hold fast. So Botha spread his remaining 5,000 Boers to heights west of Colenso to beyond Pieter's Heights, with 7 artillery pieces and 3 pom-poms spread across different vantage points. And just a quick note, Pieter's Heights is also known as Tugela Heights. Now, in case you didn't already know what a pom-pom was, these are not what many of us in the States first imagine when we hear pom-pom. You already figured this out from the context. Pom-poms in the South African War have nothing to do with cheerleading. Manufactured by Maxim Nordenfeldt, this machine gun fired explosive rounds with a range of 3,000 yards. 25 shells went into a belt fed into the gun. The pom-pom got its nickname from the sound this gun made while firing. The Boers bought 25 of these before the South African War and surprised the British with these weapons early on. These pom-poms weren't used to a very significant effect during the war, but they did wear on the nerves of those on the receiving end, and they were extremely easy to move and conceal because they didn't throw up clouds of dust when fired. The British used pom-poms for the first time while the 2-week Battle of Pieter's Heights raged, but not at this battle. We will get to that battle in a future episode. Pontoon bridges are floating bridges that modern armies used to cross bodies of water. Imagine yourself as one of Buller's troops teetering on one of these bridges on February 21st as you crossed the Tugela River. You're grateful that you're not crossing first with that idiot Sir Charles Warren's division, but are instead crossing with General Littleton, the Littleton who had successfully taken a hill using all of his available force. You are fortunate not to have suffered the brunt of Boer resistance as the Somerset Light Infantry did. They suffered 90 casualties. Those losses gave the Boers hope. The next day, February 22nd, more of your fellow Brits crossed those floating bridges, while Colonel Wynne attacked what would eventually be known as Wynne Hills. I guess that is your spoiler for today. Wynne's men fought fiercely to take and hold these hills into the early morning of February 23rd. General Buller then sent Major General Fitzroy Hart's Irishmen along with some other Brits to attack Inniskilling Hill so that they could then drive remaining Boers off of Wynne Hills. But the 400 to 500 Boers there put up a magnificent fight, losing 50 to 60 of their own, but leaving 450 British attackers laying dead or wounded in the space of a couple tennis courts. So the British on Inniskilling Hill withdrew on February 24th, with Buller realizing that the Boers were not backing down. For that evening of the 24th, British wounded suffered through the night from thirst, loud cries of pain from their own, still getting shot as much as 6 times through the night, and the sound of Boers singing hymns of deliverance across no man's land. By February 24th, Nasson reports the British had already suffered 1,400 casualties in this multi-day battle of Pieter's Heights. Hart's Irishmen lost 72% of their officers the previous day. Botha and Lucas Meyer granted General Buller a 6-hour armistice the next day so the British could tend to their wounded. Some wounded had been stranded for as long as 3 days and 2 nights in the case of those on Wynne's Hill. Many British who traveled out to the center of no man's land had still, in 4 months, never seen a Boer. At least, not up close. Lieutenant Claude Lafone walked among the British party who met Commandant Trihart and his Boer party that came to gather the Boer wounded. Lafone saw many old men, quote, with flowing tobacco-stained beards, middle-aged men with beards burnt black by the sun and sweat, clean-shaven young men with the homely Dutch features, the broad nose, and the strong chin. Their clothes, too, comprised the homely muddle of a peasant's wardrobe tweeds of all sizes and colors, homespun and shoddy. End quote. However, Trihart dressed and spoke like a gentleman. Then, one British officer, Grant, offered tobacco to the Boers for their pipes. Lafone took pictures of a few Boers who posed together. Grant asked this small party, "Aren't you fellows sick of this?" The Boers replied, "Of course, we don't like it any more than you do. But 3 years, yes, 3 years we will stay out and fight." In the distance, another Boer asked General Littleton, "How long do you think the war will last?" Littleton replied, "That depends on you. We'll go on for as long as you like. In fact, I think it'll be long business. I'm sending for my wife and children." The Boer replied, "I thought it was nearly over." To this, Littleton said, "It's only just beginning. We don't care how long it goes on. Fighting is our business. We've got nothing else to do. But it's rather tough on you." Then the armistice ended. But Buller finally learned so many of the right lessons at the same time, at the right time, from earlier mistakes. Buller threw out his old plan and went back to the drawing board on that February 25th day. Buller and Warren drew up plans this time that would thrust almost all of their now 25,000-man force at the Boers along multiple fronts to keep the Boers spread thin. Every available man and artillery piece would be concentrated on attacking Pieter's Heights, east of the railway, as well as Inniskilling and Railway Hills. By the morning of February 26th, not 6, not 26, not 56, but 76 British guns had been wheeled across the river to face Inniskilling and Railway Hills. The plan that Buller laid out to his senior officers on February 26th was this. Artillery would cover infantry as they crossed over the pontoon bridge. These 2 weeks already saw much tighter signals coordination between the British infantry and artillery, thus allowing the artillery to fire until the last possible moment. Those brigades would cross and then advance in an echelon, in 3 staggered parallel lines. Major General Barton would lead one brigade in an attack on Pieter's Heights. Major General Walter Kitchener, yes, the younger brother of the Lord Kitchener who earned infamy for his running of concentration camps during the war, younger brother Kitchener would attack Railway Hill as soon as Barton attacked Pieter's Heights. Colonel Norcott would not attack Inniskilling Hill until Kitchener's brigade did some serious damage at Railway Hill. The British had not exactly had great success with coordinated attacks, or shown great proficiency in using artillery to cover their infantry. This was all about to change on February 27th. There are a couple of ways I would ask you to consider supporting the Forgotten Wars podcast today. One way is by purchasing an item that is both practical and hopefully soon to be a vintage item, and that is the Forgotten Wars masks. Another way that you can support the show that is totally free is by sharing episode 1.3. Share it with people via email, on Facebook, on Instagram, anywhere that you share stuff that you love. Share episode 1.3. You could even use the tagline, "Listen to this episode that will teach you more than 98% of the world knows about South African history." The final free way that you can support the show is rating and writing a review of the show if you are an Apple Podcast listener. Regardless of what way you support the show, know that I need your support for this show to continue. Now, back to our show. By February 27th, the beleaguered Boer defenders had stood strong for 13 continuous days of fighting. That morning, the British crossed their pontoon bridges. By noon, Barton's force stood ready to storm Pieter's Heights. Barton's Brits climbed 500 feet up the plateau and attracted Boer fire from Railway Hill. The Irishmen did capture the central part of Pieter's Heights, but stalled once Boer guns wheeled around towards them. Then, Major General Walter Kitchener's men moved on the eastern end of Railway Hill, somehow undetected by the Boers. Kitchener's men captured some unsuspecting Boers here. Then, British artillery pounded the land ahead with precision, while some of Kitchener's men moved up the steep hill and others rolled across broken ground and leaped down into an extensive Boer trench that ran between Railway and Inniskilling hills. They bayoneted some Boers in this trench and took most prisoner around 5 p.m. Winston Churchill saw these prisoners being marched by. One of the British privates told Churchill, quote, "Only 48, sir, and there wouldn't have been so many if the officers hadn't stopped us from giving them the bayonet. I never saw such cowards in my life. Shoot at you till you come up to them, then beg for mercy. I'd teach 'em." End quote. Then Churchill watched this private go and offer those same prisoners bully beef and water. Churchill struggled to wrap his head around the contrast between the private's violent words and the private's generous acts. Having taken this trench, Kitchener's men then fired at high volumes from the Boer trench on retreating Boers. Things only got worse, or, depending which side you fought on, things only got better. As some of Kitchener's Royal Lancasters rushed forward full of adrenaline, they took heavy fire from Boers on Inniskilling Hill. So about 55 of these Royal Lancasters ran at the crest of Inniskilling Hill. When they reached the crest, they opened crossfire on Boers in the main trench who now were desperately trying to hold off Norcott's assault on Inniskilling Hill. Boers aboard Inniskilling eventually made a fighting retreat to the northwest of Inniskilling Hill and paired with some pom-poms to coat Inniskilling's skyline with heavy fire. Boers aboard Pieter's Heights, on the other hand, held for hours, even after the British gripped the central part. Still, at 6 p.m., Boers of the Heidelberg Commando would not let go of their last kopje on Pieter's Heights. The Boers dropped more Irishmen that night and would not cede their position. The remaining Irish Fusiliers waited until midnight to try to storm the remaining Boers on Pieter's Heights, only to find that the Boers had vanished. Finally, Buller triumphed. Finally, Buller used all of his artillery and most of his men to attack, and this time, to attack successfully. The casualty estimates vary depending on the source. The British suffered between 500 and 650 killed or wounded, while the Boers suffered between 250 and 500 men wounded, killed, and captured. President Creer made delusional calls, after the battle was lost, for his Boers to still hold their Ladysmith siege lines. Boer commanders and commandos ignored him. February 27th must have crushed Creer. The Boers suffered another defeat that you could argue was even greater on their western front. We will turn to that defeat next episode. Early on February 28th, remaining Boers began retreating from around Pieter's Heights towards Bulwana, en route to Beharsberg, where Botha wished they had gone to in the first place, before defeat at Pieter's Heights. On that February 28th, a British mounted brigade finally relieved Ladysmith. People of Ladysmith cheered and laughed in disbelief, with relief. After 118 days of disease and deprivation, Ladysmith was finally rescued. Lieutenant General George White limped with cane in hand to meet the column led by Lieutenant Colonel Goff. Tears almost came to White's eyes as he started to address the crowd through their cheers. White's voice broke, and then it gained strength as he gathered steam. Pakenham records White's speech like this, quote, "Thank God we kept the flag flying." White choked up again. "It cut me to the heart to reduce your rations as I did." Another long, agonizing silence, and it looked as though White would break down completely. He squeezed out a wan smile. "I promise you, though, that I'll never do it again." Everyone laughed and cheered. Then, the crowd melted away into the night. End quote. 3 days later, General Buller led a ceremonial march past through Ladysmith with his 2 divisions. I bet relief had finally fully sank in for the town's residents by then. Officers who hated Buller united. Officers with Buller through the many times he tried to free Ladysmith, and officers who were trapped inside Ladysmith. Littleton, Hamilton, and White intensified the Whisper campaign against Buller. The Whisper campaign picked up more and more momentum and would ultimately lead to Buller being dismissed from the army just a year after he returned to England. But now we are getting ahead of ourselves. Driving the Boer invaders out of Natal ultimately cost the British Natal Army 5,500 men. Boers by March were in a full disorganized retreat, not just from Natal, but also from the west. Boer commanders shouted and sent hollow threats to retreating commandos who thought of retreating all the way home. Hollow threats that deserters' horses would be shot, their stores confiscated, and their wagons torched. Nasson wraps the Boer invasion campaign up like this, quote, "Among some younger and more resolute officers, there was still a lingering hope of keeping a bit of something going in the Natal theater. But it was a forlorn one. Falling back at a trot up a familiar route, commandos stripped their Elandslaagte provisioning base of anything portable and incinerated the rest in a roaring bonfire, leaving behind a fiery scar. They were out of Natal, but not out of the war."